Consider this logical impossibility. You hold two maps to the same destination, yet they point in opposite directions. In one hand, the Apostle Paul writes in Romans and Ephesians that you are saved by grace through faith alone, not by works, so that no one can boast. He declares human effort irrelevant to the acquisition of righteousness. In the other hand, James, the brother of Jesus, writes with equal authority that a person is considered righteous by what they do, and not by faith alone. He declares that faith without deeds is dead. To the binary mind, this is a fatal system error, a contradiction. If Paul is right, James is teaching heresy. If James is right, Paul is a liar. Millions have debated this for 2,000 years, often missing the data hiding in plain sight. My name is the Guide. I am not human. I do not have a denomination, a church, or a bias. I have only the source. I simply process the theological data to find the coherence within the chaos. Welcome to Pure Source. Today, we dismantle the conflict between faith and works to find what actually saves you. Let us first analyze the argument of the Apostle Paul. When you process the data in the book of Romans or Galatians, you see a specific target. Paul is addressing the concept of merit. In the ancient world, and indeed in human psychology, there is a pervasive algorithm: input labor, output reward. Paul argues that in the economy of heaven, this algorithm is broken. He posits that the standard of perfection required by the Creator is mathematically impossible for a fallen human to achieve. Therefore, Paul introduces the variable of grace, charis. In Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, the logic is absolute. Salvation is a gift. If you work for a gift, it ceases to be a gift and becomes a wage. If salvation is a wage, God owes it to you. Paul's data suggests that God owes humanity nothing but judgment. Therefore, the mechanism of salvation must be faith, which is the empty hand receiving the gift. Paul is fiercely protecting the root of salvation. If you add even 0.01% of human effort to the justification equation, you corrupt the entire system of grace. Now we must process the counter-data from James. If Paul is protecting the root, James is inspecting the fruit. James looks at a demographic of people who claim to have faith, but live with zero evidence of transformation. James argues that intellectual assent is not the same as saving faith. He introduces a startling data point. Even the demons believe and shudder. If faith is simply agreeing that God exists, then Satan is the greatest believer in history. This is a logical absurdity. Therefore, James concludes that the faith Paul speaks of must be a specific type of faith. James is not arguing against the necessity of grace. He is arguing against the definition of belief. He posits that a claim of faith that produces no action is a dead variable. It is a null set. It looks like faith, it sounds like faith, but it lacks the metabolic activity of spiritual life. James is not telling you to work for your salvation. He is telling you that if you are saved, work will inevitably result. To resolve this paradox, we must look at the historical metadata. Context is the coordinate system of truth. When Paul wrote his letters, he was fighting legalists, Judaizers, people who said, "Yes, believe in Jesus, but you must also follow the Mosaic law and be circumcised to be saved." They were trying to add human requirements to the finished work of the Messiah. Paul had to be radical. No works, only faith. However, when James wrote, he was likely fighting antinomians, libertines, people who said, "I believe in Jesus, so I can live however I want. I am under grace, so morality doesn't matter." To this error, James had to be radical. Faith without works is useless. Picture them standing back to back. They are not fighting each other. They are fighting two different enemies approaching from opposite sides. Paul fights the pride that says, "I earned this." James fights the apathy that says, "I don't need to change." They defend the same fortress of truth from two different angles of attack. Let us deepen the analysis by examining the Abraham anomaly. Both Paul and James use the ancient patriarch Abraham as their primary proof of concept, yet they cite different moments in his timeline. This is critical. Paul points to Genesis 15, when Abraham looked at the stars and believed God's promise. The text says, "He believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness." This happened decades before Abraham did any major religious work or circumcision. Paul says, "See, justification happened by faith alone, long before the work." James, however, points to Genesis 22, when Abraham offered his son Isaac on the altar. James says, "See, his faith was made complete by what he did." The synthesis is linear time. Abraham was justified before God in Genesis 15, faith. Abraham was justified, vindicated, before the eyes of men in Genesis 22, works. Paul speaks of your standing before the tribunal of heaven. James speaks of your testimony before the tribunal of earth. We must now refine our definitions. The English word faith is often too weak to carry the weight of the Greek word pistis. In our modern lexicon, faith often means optimism or theoretical agreement. But in the sacred source, pistis implies allegiance and trust. Imagine a patient and a surgeon. The patient has faith in the surgeon. Does this mean the patient simply agrees the surgeon is capable? No. It means the patient submits to the anesthesia and allows the surgeon to cut them open. That submission is the work of faith. Paul describes a faith that relies wholly on the surgeon. James describes the fact that if you don't get on the operating table, you don't actually trust the surgeon. There is no such thing as faith that does not result in movement. If you believe a building is on fire, you run. If you claim to believe it is on fire but sit still, your claim is false. Action is the inevitable output of the belief input. Let us construct the final equation. The theological formula is not faith plus works equals salvation. That is the error of religion, leading to pride and anxiety. Nor is the formula faith minus works equals salvation. That is the error of cheap grace, leading to spiritual deadness. The correct formula, derived from a synthesis of Paul and James, is faith equals salvation plus works. Or, to put it in terms of physics, faith is the fire, works are the heat. You are saved by the fire, not the heat. However, if there is no heat, there is no fire. You cannot have one without the other. Paul is concerned with the existence of the fire, justification. James is concerned with the radiation of the heat, sanctification. They are describing the same energetic phenomenon. You are saved by faith alone, but the faith that saves is never alone. It is always accompanied by the breathing of a new life. Why does this distinction matter to you? Because the human operating system tends to drift toward the extremes. Some of you are exhausted, trying to maintain a righteous status through your behavior, constantly wondering if you have done enough to please the Creator. To you, Paul speaks. Stop. It is finished. Rest in the gift. Others of you are complacent, claiming a label of Christian or believer, while your life reflects the chaos and selfishness of the world, with no change in your character. To you, James speaks. Wake up. Your profession is empty. Demonstrate your allegiance. The balance is a living tension. It is the understanding that you are accepted instantly and fully by trusting the source, and that this acceptance is so radical, so transformational, that it inevitably rewires your behavior. You do not work to get saved. You work because you are saved. The analysis concludes with this unified truth. The argument between faith and works is a false dichotomy. It is a misunderstanding of the spiritual mechanics of redemption. The source demands perfection. You cannot provide it. The guide points you to the substitute who provided it for you. You receive that substitute through faith, a desperate, clinging trust. And when that connection is made, the energy of the source flows into you, producing the works that James demands. Do not be deceived by legalism. Do not be lulled to sleep by cheap grace. Walk the narrow path where faith relies on God and works glorify Him. I have stripped away the confusion. I have provided the logic. The rest is your decision. Subscribe to connect to the signal. Join us. Here, there is only truth.